Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel Poetry and Protest, where I review new books, mostly of poetry currently, and also share footage and content relating to protest around the world. My name is Rebecca Ruth Gould, and today I'll be talking about six poetry books that I've been reviewing for the Poetry Foundation's blog called Harriet. I've discussed a few of these in previous videos, but I thought it would be useful for me to introduce you to a wider range of the texts that I've been working on and reviewing, and also to talk a little bit about the, shall we say, politics and poetics of reviewing books. So there are six books here. All of them are published in 2021, so that's kind of exciting. I've been really struck by just how many amazing books are coming out now and how many of them are not going to ever be reviewed, because we receive in the range of maybe 20 or 30, just 20 or 30 titles you could say are shortlisted to be reviewed. That's out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of really wonderful and fabulous texts. And I think some of the most ignored books tend to be poetry and translation. So I really try to prioritize that in my reviews. And as I hope I've mentioned before, these reviews that I'm writing are restricted to 300 words each. So that's very short. In some cases, for example, for this epic poem, the Kalevala, that's an astonishingly short space in which to review a book, but I find that a very interesting exercise because it concentrates the mind. And I'm also struck by how often I think it serves the reader's needs, right? Because the reader just wants to know whether that book is going to suit them well or not. And sometimes having the kind of digression that some reviews contain with all kinds of extraneous opinions and so forth is sometimes not that useful. So I feel like if one has to make a choice between reviewing many books briefly and a couple of books in depth, sometimes literature is better served by the first approach. So these six books, actually, I think it's been a total of 9 books that I reviewed so far, but I actually can't find the physical copies of 2 of them, so I'll get to those later once I find them in my clutter department. The first, and I think I will maybe read a poem from each of these books and just talk about them perhaps a bit in relation to each other, just highlight what excites me about them. So I've already done a video about this one, The Wild Fox of Yemen by Yemeni-American poet Threa Almontaser. So I won't rehearse what I've already written about the book, but it is a really exciting book on many different levels. I think the poetics of the book is very exciting. We might compare this to, say, Walt Whitman's intervention in 19th century American literature. It strikes a new note in poetics. In fact, and the reason why I mentioned that is because she won the Walt Whitman Award for poetry from the American Academy of Poets. It's also interesting sort of graphically, the use of Arabic in the book, and many of the poems are set in Yemen and about Yemen. And one thing I haven't quite worked out is what all of these, the book is studied with photographs. Here's one example. You can see where the eyes should be. And let me show you again where the eyes should be in that photograph. They're scratched out, and no interpretation is offered. I'll give you another example in a second as to what exactly that scratching out means. But I think we're encouraged to speculate perhaps that these are family photos. And the protagonist of these poems is remembering her childhood. Here you go again. And something about the war on Yemen. Maybe you can't see it as well in this image, but I'll give you a close-up in the video so you can see how the eyes are scratched out better. So something about the trauma of memory, I think, is one of the themes. So I'll just quickly read one of the poems called Yemen, Rising as Poorest Country in the World. And it has an epigraph. Ruling Yemen is like dancing on the heads of snakes. That's by ex-president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh. This country, like a pan of matouf, crisped too dark. This country at the map's edge like a scrunched fist. This country, a trading port, a locust flying full speed, a gin queen, a pleasant resonant, a Google of glimmering noses. This country who invites the whole village over for tea is a blue divan, a spice road in Arabia Felix. Yemen of wadded cheeks, feral cat, and snake fights. a hen walking into your kitchen, kids outside chasing the cock who chases Fajr, the country of spithed grandmothers in gaudy jalabayat, dancing to the beat of their own heart drum. As they wait on the long line for petrol, this country is a canal between Al-Nas and the divine. It is suit jackets draped over thobes, jambia blades at the waist, or Rahman in a tucked futa, squatting at the knees to eat. This country is a dwindled miswak, a line of red teeth chomping down the bark of the kingdom. A Yemeni who will not fear the hereafter, busy carrying jerry cans of water from an aid camp miles away. The water here is weaponized. The water here is full of parasites and pirates. If you swim too long, either one can steal you. The politicians that dug themselves into our fields were bad seeds. They sprouted only the poisonous parts, left the best of Allah somewhere else. National Unity Day was yesterday. I lit a sparkler that looked like worms on my cat's ass, white electric wiggling where I waved it. Baladi as twins wrestling for separation in the womb. The two linked through blue cord and brain folds, the north come out, hot as lightning and just as striking. The south's head, a beautiful gleaming coffee berry. One tries to reach through the divide. Asma'ani. The prophet once said, the people of Yemen have the softest hearts of all. I've been trying to ensnare you in your own guilt. I never aimed for liquid speech. I should have been more rhetorical. Maybe someday I'll push the language of the poor through my mouth and master it. So that's a quite striking poem. And I think the line that says, the water here is weaponized, that's one thing that will resonate with a lot of people who know anything about the conflict in Yemen. So I also just want to underline it. One thing that's been most fulfilling about this journey through poetry and translation is just the diversity of texts that I've been able to review. So this is a Yemeni American poet, and there's the British poet Nathaniel Tarn, the German Romantic poet Friedrich Hölderlin, translation of Mexican American poetry by María Baranda, the Finnish Kalevala, an American poet, Jennifer Militello, and a Swedish poet writing about Syria and other places of the Middle East and Africa, Marie Silkeberg. I think next I'll read a poem by Marie Silkeberg. This is a very experimental collection. As you can see too here, the visual dimension is really important. It's a beautifully produced book full of the scenes from the civil war in Yemen. The sun. And this poem is Abu Dhabi Rub al-Hali. It's a section at the beginning of the poem. The sun, he says, when the plane takes off from Doha. See it? You thought it was the moon. You say so. It looks like the moon. You watch the sunset over the bay, the city during landing. Structures, you think, to sprint at the right moment. Take what can be taken. Wet snows the 1st of May, you read. Arise, ye workers, sings inside you. Since something has to sing. In the capitalist dictatorship, 900,000 citizens, the rest are laborers for various high or low wages without civil rights, papers. You fall asleep, almost. I think this poet uses the second person very effectively in her poems. So just moving on, and as I said, in some cases I have videos and writing reviews themselves that offer more detailed engagements with specific poems. So this, I think, is the only poem I reviewed by an American poet. And it's interesting because I had a difficult time with reviewing this book, The Pact by Jennifer Militello, and perhaps I was trying to reflect on why it was so difficult. And I think because it was the one that was most descriptive of my own experience growing up, and it was a very familiar world, a kind of suburban white world, and I just found it difficult to write about that because when I look towards poetry and towards criticism, I tend to look towards something that is a bit more at a remove from who I am and what I'm familiar with. And so but it's a really interesting, striking collection, mostly about her siblings and her mother. And one poem in particular that I found very cryptic and interesting. I was particularly interested by the title, which is the biblical reference, Job's Comfort. So I'll just read this here. It describes the poet in bed with her sister, Something strange is happening with her father. He's being abusive in some way, but nothing is really spelled out. But it's a haunting poem about sort of a child coming to consciousness of evil. Once you were a god, I could feel enter the house from my room. Once I knew to shut the door when you returned. Once my muscles tensed in anticipation of the moment you came and rained your anger down. My sister and I cringed. We'd hear the car pull in, snap the television off, and run. But there was no escaping the key in the lock. The door swung back, the sound of your heels crossing in the floor. We were soft-bodied in our shells. I love that line. Soft-bodied in our shells. We hunched quiet as the corners where we crouched. We split up to decrease the... We would sacrifice ourselves for one another. Except I remember the night you pulled her from bed and set her before our father to accuse him. How she must have stood in the living room while you screamed, head down, fist clenched. Although I couldn't see, I was huddled fearful in my bed. All I could think of, I was glad it wasn't me. So I'm just to speculate a little bit about that title. Again, I don't think it's entirely clear what exactly is happening. I get the sense of some kind of abuse. I'm not sure if it's sexual or not. But Job's comfort, and there's a differential between the sisters, right? So one sister is being forced to describe a very painful experience to her father, or to accuse her father in some way of something painful that happened. The other sister is watching. And so in the story of Job, that's where Job suffers great afflictions, and his friends kind of, first they try to comfort him, but they also feel a sense of relief that it's not, that the sort of calamity is not happening to them. So that's some kind of lesson there about how we relate to other people's suffering. And then there's the next collection I want to quickly introduce is this María Baranda, published by Yale University Press. Again, it's not even technically published yet by the press. This is a review copy. It's a really interesting collection. María Baranda, she's a living Mexican-American poet. She has lots of classical references to Latin poetry, ancient Latin poetry, Greek epic, Suar Inés de la Cruz, the early modern Spanish poet. And I will just read, and she also describes sort of the natural world in a very creative way. You might even compare it to something like John Donne, the poet who uses very elaborate metaphors. So here's a poem, or it's an excerpt of a poem. And also what's interesting about this collection is that it's a translation. I mean, it is her collected work. So it's her first collected works in English. And she's written, I think, 15 volumes of poetry. Or at least 12 of which have been translated. Those numbers are very approximate. So this collection has something like 12 different translators are included here. So it's an interesting kind of test case in examining the relationship between the poet's voice and the translator's voice. But what I found is that the voice is very consistent actually across the different translations. So this is from the collection called A Hive of Seabirds. Or sorry, it's from the long poem. The poem itself is called The Beach, and this is part 4. You want a new comb to change what you think. Skin won't reach the fire. The chorus insists on vegetating under the dawn, gathering the frightened palms at boiling melting point. It's night. Outside, the wind tapping against. The dream light wakes the appetite of those who arrive at the bottom of absence. There are those who open their skirts the way they slowly open bottles in summer. Only the vertical blood diluted in the syringe sticks to the wall, sucks the ration of time, sucks the newly to be in the world with an arm extended in the dying night body within, whose language is irreparable and everything. Your faith melts a little in the window of the door. You advance wet and dead by the stone. You say the new flowers, the gravestones of air. What has and has no importance is yours. You watch over the language of the guilty. You paint your entrance to the cave sky blue. What resists and prays and then multiplies is another prayer, another voice, another perimeter. The age of each deciphers your argument. You see transparent tides in a country where the key to pardon is but an earthly method. They call it calamity, survival, mutable time. While a girl goes whistling in these lines, her eyes spark in the dark. They condemn her innocence with your name that enters and leaves through her ears, and not the lightning in the mouth, not the mouth and the lightning. Persuade her to join the first cry, the first moment, warm and flushed in the mental grave of your words. Come on, so that love is inside the mouth. You'd like to dig up her lips, but you can't even open the door, your mask one of panic. And one of the most striking lines there for me, and perhaps it's relevant to mention that the capitalization somehow really makes it stand out. They there call it calamity, survival, mutable time. Such a great phrase. So the next collection, which I've already introduced in more detail, so I'll just briefly read a poem here. It's Nathaniel Tarn's epic. It's a sort of new genre of poetry in which he has these sections, or what does he call them? There's separate poems that are comprised an epic about the life of Friedrich Hölderlin, who had a very tragic life. He was schizophrenic towards the final couple decades of his existence. And I'll just take a selection from the 16th Hölderlin, in other words, the 16th section of this epic poem. And it deals with one of Hölderlin's most recurrent, persistent themes, the kind of the specter of the East. What does German Romanticism have to benefit from the poetry of the Eastern world? The sun on earth arises out of Asia and marches west, arriving at the very gates of landscapes men recognize as home. Waters of all the rivers known to them rush from the western highlands back towards east, a gift of the home countries. Now, have you ever been out to those east, beyond the Athens and the Spartas? You have not seen even those, only imagine them at will. Have you a knowledge of Asian treasures? Let me come in as soul, as anima, and take you, dear one, to the furthest east that this planet worships. Take you to Isfahan of blinding light, white cover for its sapphire mosques. On out to India, its sole Ajanta of the divinest paintings, out to the Taj, the burial of heaven's wives, out from Khajuraho, a celebration of the body's love, then on to Angkor of the deep Cambodia's, pagan of deep Burma's, Borobudur of the deep Indonesia's, and over to the Duan Huang's caves in deepest China, the celebrated gardens of a rash Japan. All these and more, as people urge right now, tempting interminably and populous to spend again, as if this century knew nothing beyond their spending, building for an uncertain, virtually fatal future, being the one only end they might wish to ignore. How fortunate were you, dear friend, to know so little of the earth beyond your property, so that the property would never need to be enlarged or bettered in its decorations or in its access, as everything now in this century requires to be improved, and thus destroyed by overpopulation and the desire for more forevermore, as the earth shrinks beneath them, as sun rises again into the skies to work annihilation on the earth. So this again is the second person voice, Nathaniel Tarn speaking to Friedrich Hölderlin, interestingly highlighting how, on the one hand, he was very fascinated by the East. A lot of his poems take place. Hölderlin has a poem called Patmos in Greece that really draws on Oriental imagery, yet he didn't travel very much. He didn't actually see very much of the world. Nathaniel Tarn did, by the way. And so I thought that, and that's an interesting line at the end, and also a contrast between the 18th century romantic movement, when perhaps some of the brutality of capitalism and European conquest was only just becoming evident, at least to people in Europe. And now, this world we live in, where, as this section ends, the sun rises again into the skies to work annihilation on the earth. So the last book, I'm not going to read from it. It is another epic. And I don't really think that a short excerpt would do justice to this book. It's a fascinating text. I really recommend that you buy as soon as possible. And what's interesting about this translation of the Kalevala, which is regarded as the best one, there are 3 or 4 others into English that have been done over the course of the last century. Is that it's actually done by a blind poet who was himself of Finnish birth, but then his life work that he dedicated his final decades to was to translate the Kalevala using a Braille transcription. And this is the one where, I mean, it's a translation where the poetry of the text is felt because he was a poet. And there's also something kind of the oral quality of the text is also palpable. The poet had memorized much of the poem before he undertook to translate it. Eino Friberg. So that's it for the 6 books of poetry and translation that I've been reviewing over the past several months, and I hope it's inspired you to start reading and really become aware of all the great work out there.